You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Employee monitoring has become a standard practice in modern workplaces, driven by the need to protect company assets, maintain productivity, and ensure compliance with regulations. Monitoring can take many forms, including digital oversight of network traffic, logging keystrokes on endpoints, reviewing email content, recording calls, and placing video cameras in strategic locations. While these practices serve legitimate business purposes, they also raise significant privacy concerns. Employees expect a certain degree of respect for their personal dignity, even when using company systems or working on employer premises. The legal and ethical challenge is to balance legitimate oversight with fairness and transparency. Employers must provide clear notice of monitoring activities, explain the scope and purpose, and apply safeguards to prevent excessive intrusion. When implemented responsibly, monitoring can reinforce accountability without undermining trust between employer and employee. Acceptable use policies are the foundation of lawful monitoring. These policies set expectations by informing employees how company systems may be used and what monitoring will occur. For example, a policy might state that email and internet use are primarily for business purposes and subject to review. Explicit notice ensures employees cannot claim ignorance if their communications are monitored. Courts and regulators often view the existence of clear policies as a key factor in determining whether monitoring is lawful. By making policies accessible, requiring acknowledgement, and updating them as technology evolves, employers provide both legal protection and practical clarity for employees. Network traffic inspection is a common monitoring tool used to detect security threats and prevent data loss. Employers may scan web traffic, block malicious sites, or analyze patterns for signs of insider threats. However, scope boundaries are essential. Monitoring should focus on legitimate risks, such as the transmission of sensitive customer data, rather than indiscriminately capturing personal browsing habits. Data loss prevention systems can flag suspicious activity without retaining unnecessary personal content. By narrowing the scope, employers ensure monitoring serves its intended purpose while minimizing privacy intrusions. Employees are more likely to accept monitoring when they see it as a protective measure rather than a form of constant surveillance. Endpoint monitoring, including keystroke logging and screenshot capture, presents even sharper privacy questions. These tools can reveal granular details of employee activity, but they risk being overly invasive. Proportionality principles require that such methods be reserved for specific investigations or high-risk scenarios, not everyday use. For instance, keystroke logging might be justified in investigating fraud but excessive if applied across an entire workforce. Employers must weigh the benefit of granular monitoring against the harm to employee trust. Transparency and restraint are key. Disclose when such measures might be used and ensure their application is tightly controlled and documented. Email monitoring is another widespread practice. Employers may review email content for compliance with policies, scan for malware, or archive messages for regulatory reasons. Metadata such as sender, recipient, and timestamps can also provide insights without exposing content. Retention configurations are important, balancing legal obligations with privacy considerations. For example, financial institutions may be required to retain emails for several years, but employers should avoid indefinite retention without purpose. Clear policies that explain how and why emails are monitored, along with accessible archiving practices, demonstrate respect for employee privacy while meeting business and regulatory needs. Call monitoring requires special attention to consent laws. In some states, only one party to a conversation must consent to recording, while in others, all parties must agree. Employers must tailor their practices to comply with state-specific rules, often by playing pre-recorded notices at the start of calls. Monitoring may be justified for quality assurance, training, or compliance, but employees and customers must be informed. Failure to comply with consent rules can lead to legal liability and reputational damage. By applying transparent processes and limiting recording to legitimate business needs, employers can use call monitoring responsibly. Voice over Internet Protocol Systems, or VoIP, add new dimensions to call monitoring. These systems often generate logs that capture call metadata, such as duration, participants, and even call routing paths. While valuable for troubleshooting and compliance, VoIP logs should be handled with the same care as traditional call records. Employers must define permissible uses of this data and restrict access to authorized personnel. Overcollection or misuse of VoIP metadata risks crossing into unnecessary surveillance. By setting clear policies, encrypting data, and limiting retention, organizations demonstrate responsible stewardship of these increasingly prevalent systems. Video surveillance plays a visible role in workplace monitoring. Cameras are commonly used to deter theft, enhance security, and monitor compliance with safety protocols. However, their placement is critical. Cameras must not be installed in sensitive areas such as restrooms, locker rooms, or designated break spaces where privacy is expected. Employers should also avoid continuous surveillance of workstations unless justified by high security needs. Notice is, again, essential employees should know where cameras are located and the purpose behind their use. Respectful placement and communication help reinforce that cameras are for safety and security, not micromanagement. Remote work has intensified debates about monitoring. Tools now exist to track login times, capture screenshots, or even activate webcams to verify presence. While employers want assurance of productivity, overly intrusive monitoring in home environments risks serious backlash. Monitoring should focus on work-related activity rather than extending into private spaces. For example, logging activity within company applications may be acceptable, while webcam surveillance in a home office is far more problematic. Employers must calibrate practices carefully, respecting that the boundary between professional and personal life is thinner when employees work remotely. Bring your own device programs create further challenges. Employees may use personal smartphones or laptops for work, raising questions about what employers can monitor. Containerization and mobile device management tools offer solutions by creating secure, isolated workspaces on personal devices. This allows employers to monitor and control work-related applications while leaving personal data untouched. Clear policies must explain how data will be segregated and reassure employees that personal photos, messages, or contacts will not be accessed. This technical and policy-based segregation helps balance security needs with privacy expectations. Access governance is essential when monitoring tools are deployed. Administrator roles should be carefully assigned, with separation of duties to prevent abuse. For example, one team may configure monitoring systems while another reviews alerts, reducing opportunities for misuse. Regular audits of admin activity provide accountability and deter unauthorized surveillance. Governance structures reinforce that monitoring is conducted for legitimate business purposes under controlled conditions. Employees gain confidence knowing that even those with access to monitoring tools are themselves subject to oversight. Productivity analytics, such as scoring systems that rank employees based on activity, have grown in popularity but must be approached cautiously. While these tools can identify workflow bottlenecks or highlight high performers, they risk reducing complex human work into simplistic metrics. Employees may feel unfairly judged if scores do not reflect qualitative contributions or contextual factors. Transparency is essential. Employees should know what is being measured and how scores are calculated. Employers must also consider whether such analytics genuinely improve performance or simply create pressure and mistrust. Balanced implementation can provide insights without dehumanizing the workforce. Data minimization principles should guide the collection of telemetry, screenshots, and audio captures. Monitoring should capture only what is necessary for the defined purpose. For example, logging whether files are transferred outside the network may be sufficient without recording every keystroke. Similarly, retaining selective screenshots during suspicious activity may be preferable to continuous screen capture. Minimization reduces both privacy risks and storage burdens. By emphasizing necessity and proportionality, employers can design monitoring systems that achieve security objectives while avoiding unnecessary intrusion. Retention schedules apply not only to email and call records but also to logs, recordings, and surveillance artifacts. Employers must define how long monitoring data will be kept and ensure timely disposal. Indefinite retention creates risks of misuse, data breaches, and unnecessary exposure in litigation. For instance, surveillance footage might only need to be retained for 30 days unless linked to an investigation. Transparent retention policies show employees that monitoring data will not be stockpiled indefinitely, and reassure regulators that practices align with privacy and compliance standards. Finally, monitoring data must be protected with strong security safeguards. Encryption, access controls, and role-based permissions are fundamental to keeping this information secure. Because monitoring data often contains sensitive details about employee communications and behavior, its compromise can cause significant harm. Employers should restrict access to monitoring records, log usage, and ensure secure disposal when data reaches the end of its life cycle. By safeguarding monitoring data as carefully as customer or financial data, employers demonstrate respect for employee privacy and maintain compliance with regulatory obligations. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. The concept of a reasonable expectation of privacy is central when evaluating workplace monitoring practices. Courts often weigh whether employees could reasonably expect privacy in the context of technology use. For example, an employee using a company email system after signing an acceptable use policy has little expectation of privacy. By contrast, monitoring a personal phone call made during a break on a personal device might be seen as intrusive. Employers must align their monitoring scope with these expectations, reinforcing that workplace systems are for business use while respecting personal boundaries. The clearer the communication and policies, the less likely employees will feel surprised or misled. This principle is the bedrock for determining whether monitoring crosses the line into unlawful or excessive intrusion. State wiretap and eavesdropping laws add another layer of complexity. Some states allow recordings if one party consents, while others require the consent of all parties involved. These rules apply to phone calls, video meetings, and in some cases, even in-person conversations. Employers who record without proper consent risk civil liability and criminal penalties. A practical safeguard is to provide recorded notices at the start of calls or meetings, ensuring compliance across jurisdictions. Awareness of state-specific requirements prevents costly mistakes and reinforces transparency. Employers must also recognize that rules differ for internal monitoring versus customer interactions, tailoring policies accordingly. Recording in public accommodations introduces another dimension. For businesses that interact with customers, recording conversations or video in public spaces may be subject to different standards than internal monitoring. For example, a retail store may use cameras for theft prevention, but those cameras cannot be hidden in dressing rooms or restrooms. Customer-facing recordings may also raise obligations for signage, such as posting notices that surveillance is in use. Employers must balance security needs with respect for customer privacy, applying clear signage and policies to avoid accusations of covert monitoring. By aligning practices with public expectations, organizations protect both compliance and reputation. Biometric login systems are increasingly used to secure employee access to systems and facilities. These systems may rely on fingerprints, facial recognition, or iris scans. While convenient and secure, biometric data is uniquely sensitive. It cannot be changed if compromised. Employers must obtain informed consent, explaining what data will be collected, how it will be stored, and how long it will be retained. Some states, such as Illinois, impose strict requirements under biometric privacy laws. Secure storage, limited access, and defined retention schedules are non-negotiable. These safeguards ensure that authentication data enhances security without creating disproportionate privacy risks. Location-based services expand monitoring into the physical realm, often through fleet management tools or GPS-enabled devices. Employers may track company vehicles to optimize routing, confirm delivery times, or monitor for misuse. Yet constant location tracking of employees can feel invasive, especially if it continues outside work hours. Notice is essential. Employees must know when and how their locations are monitored, and policies should set clear limits. For example, location tracking may be deactivated during personal use of company vehicles. Transparent boundaries prevent abuse and reinforce that tracking is tied to legitimate business needs rather than unrestricted surveillance. Union and collective bargaining agreements also influence monitoring practices. In unionized workplaces, the introduction of new monitoring technologies may be considered a change in working conditions that requires negotiation. For example, deploying keystroke logging software across a unionized workforce could be challenged as an unfair labor practice if not bargained in good faith. Employers must recognize that monitoring is not only a technical issue but also a labor relations concern. Respecting bargaining obligations ensures compliance with labor law and helps maintain cooperative workplace relationships. Ignoring these obligations risks legal challenges and eroded trust. Targeted surveillance and investigatory contexts must follow clear exceptions and documentation. Employers may have legitimate reasons to increase monitoring for specific employees suspected of misconduct, such as data theft or harassment. However, such surveillance should be documented, time-limited, and tied to a clear purpose. Broad or indefinite application undermines proportionality. For example, installing screen capture tools on an employee's device for a defined investigation period may be reasonable if properly justified. Documenting the rationale protects employers if the surveillance is later challenged, showing that it was necessary, limited, and carefully managed. Third-party monitoring vendors introduce contractual obligations. When employers outsource monitoring services, they must ensure that contracts impose confidentiality, data security, and compliance responsibilities on the vendor. Employers remain accountable for vendor actions and must confirm that service providers meet regulatory requirements. For example, if a vendor manages email archiving, the contract should require encryption, secure storage, and timely disposal. Employers should also retain audit rights, allowing them to verify that vendors uphold their commitments. This ensures that outsourcing does not become a weak link in employee data protection. Cross-border data flows complicate monitoring when global platforms are used. Monitoring tools may transmit logs or recordings to servers in different countries, triggering international data protection laws. For example, transferring employee monitoring data from Europe to the United States requires compliance with EU data protection regulations. Employers must account for localization requirements, contractual safeguards, and international transfer mechanisms. Failure to consider these obligations can lead to penalties and reputational harm. Global organizations must design monitoring systems that respect diverse legal environments while maintaining consistent standards of fairness and security. Monitoring data is not only used for compliance, but also for detecting policy violations in real time. Incident detection systems can raise alerts when unusual activity occurs, such as large file transfers or repeated access attempts to restricted systems. Employers must set thresholds carefully to avoid overwhelming teams with false positives or creating unnecessary suspicion. Triage processes should prioritize serious threats while minimizing intrusion into ordinary employee behavior. Clear thresholds demonstrate proportionality and ensure that monitoring is used for security, not micromanagement. These practices reinforce that monitoring is a protective measure rather than a punitive tool. Employees may request access to information collected about them, including monitoring logs or recordings. Employers must prepare to handle such requests, particularly in jurisdictions that recognize employee data access rights. Transparency in responding to these requests builds trust and demonstrates accountability. For example, an employee might request confirmation of what data is logged about their computer use. Employers should have structured processes to provide appropriate information without compromising investigations or security. Balancing transparency with confidentiality ensures fairness and compliance with emerging privacy rights. Complaint channels provide employees with a voice in how monitoring is conducted. Employers should establish confidential avenues for raising concerns about monitoring practices, paired with anti-retaliation protections. For example, an employee who believes monitoring has exceeded its scope should be able to report the issue without fear of reprisal. Neutral review processes reinforce fairness, ensuring that complaints are evaluated objectively. These safeguards transform monitoring from a one-sided practice into a system with checks and balances, strengthening organizational integrity. Periodic risk assessments help employers calibrate their monitoring systems. As technologies evolve, the risks of both under-monitoring and over-monitoring change. For example, remote work may increase the need for secure access logging, but also elevate the importance of respecting private spaces. Regular reviews allow employers to adjust configurations, retire outdated tools, and refine retention policies. Assessments should involve cross-functional teams, including IT, HR, and legal, to balance technical capabilities with employee rights. This proactive approach ensures monitoring remains effective and proportionate over time. Governance committees provide oversight for monitoring practices. These groups, often composed of senior leaders and compliance officers, review policies, assess ethical implications, and approve major changes. For example, introducing AI-driven productivity scoring might require governance review to ensure it aligns with fairness and proportionality principles. Governance structures prevent unilateral decisions that could erode trust and ensure that monitoring policies are shaped by diverse perspectives. They also demonstrate accountability to regulators and employees alike, reinforcing that monitoring is guided by clear ethical and legal standards. Employee monitoring across computers, email, phone, and video is therefore best understood as a governance challenge rather than a purely technical exercise. Reasonable expectation of privacy, consent laws, labor relations, and data protection rules all define the boundaries of lawful practice. Employers who focus on clear notice, minimal scope, and targeted use of monitoring tools can achieve their business objectives while respecting employee dignity. Secure stewardship of monitoring data, reinforced by audits, governance, and accountability, ensures that oversight strengthens rather than undermines workplace trust. By integrating these principles, organizations can balance oversight and privacy in ways that support both compliance and culture. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.